Hi, thanks a lot, Laura. Really appreciate the invitation to come and talk to everyone here. I've had a great day and a half already in the city and met up with a bunch of you who I've known over the years, so very excited to be here. And I apologize if I have a tendency, when I talk publicly, my Australian accent tends to get a bit thick. So if you can't understand what I'm saying, please raise your hand. So I thought I'd start off by telling you guys a little bit about where I come from and telling you a story. This beautiful scene is a small town on the north coast of New South Wales, Australia, called Yamba. And the thing about Yamba is it's a beautiful place, and it's not overly developed. It's about 2 hours drive from the nearest small regional airport, about 8 hours drive from Sydney. That's a pretty common characteristic for small towns in Australia. We have about nearly 40,000 miles of coastline, including our islands, and so not all of the towns have high rises and airports near them. Most of that 40,000 is pretty beautiful with great surf and weather, and if it wasn't for all the deadly creatures, would probably be pretty idyllic. Nonetheless, you know, a lot of these towns exist, and they're not hyper developed, as I said. They're sort of away from the urbanizing technological trend most of the world is sort of on. So I was in Yamba in January this year, and my father-in-law had just renovated his house. He got a new TV and sound system installed, and we were having a little bit of trouble with it. So I was walking down the main street, it's kind of a main street town, and I think I was getting an ice cream or a coffee or something, and I came across this community notice board, you know, the ones with all the different flyers stapled up on them. And there was this one flyer, it was printed out on green paper, on a printer that was clearly running out of ink. And it was done by this guy, Barry. And he'd used Word and clip art to the full extent of their capabilities. He'd used about 6 different fonts and all these different little images, these icons. And he was an audio-visual installer. And on this flyer, he'd said, call him up, get a free quote anytime, and that I should support local business. So I thought that was interesting. I tore off one of the little tassels with the phone number at the bottom of the page that you see, but I didn't call straight away. I was at the pub later that day, and I thought I'd ask around. So I asked this guy, and he knew Barry and vouched for him and said he was a good bloke and that I should give him the work. And to cut a long story short, I called the number. His wife answered the phone. Of course, it was his landline because he doesn't get great cell reception in most of the town. So I eventually got onto him, and he came around, did the work, and it was a really positive, amazing experience. And he was actually a really good guy, and every time I go back there, I end up having a beer with him. He didn't have a website, a Facebook page, or a Twitter handle. There was no Yelp or Angie's List that helped me make this decision. He didn't have custom APIs that he'd built for his own mobile app or for third-party sites to send him business. His business was mainly word of mouth, and it was based on the trust inherent in a small community. He was truly operating in a village economy. I thought I'd contrast this story a little bit. Earlier this year, I was at TechCrunch Disrupt in San Francisco. The winning company at the startup showcase was a company called Alfred out of Boston that many of you might know. Alfred describes themselves as being the operating system for your life. You get assigned a human person called an Alfred, and they act as kind of a butler service part-time. They organize a bunch of other services for you: house cleaning, dry cleaning, groceries. Oftentimes what they do is they actually hook into the back end of other on-demand services like Instacart or Washio. So if you think about it, they're kind of like a service layer on top of a service layer on top of an actual local service business. And I think it's actually a really cool and challenging business. There's some good operational and technical challenges. Now the clicker's not working. There we go. But if you sort of take a step back and think about what that means, here's a startup that's been put on a pedestal, arguably one of the premier startup showcases in Silicon Valley, the heart of technological innovation in the world. And if you think about it, what they're trying to do is enhance or replicate a lot of the same things that exist in small towns all around the world already. They're trying to make the village economy more efficient and scalable, but at the end of the day, it's still a local village economy that they're tapping into. Uber and Airbnb, these businesses, Yelp, they kind of do the same thing. And a lot of people talk about these companies as if they've scoured the world to try and find something that's broken and then try to disrupt that industry. They're the words that we use all the time, right? I prefer to look at it from the other direction, that they've actually found something that's inherently good in the way that we live our lives, and they're just trying to improve upon it. They're trying to enhance it. So, to understand how software affects these local village economies, I think it's useful to first talk about how all kinds of technology actually led us to the point that we're at. How did these village economies develop? And so what I thought I'd do is take a little bit of a step away from software and startups for just a couple of minutes. Because I think the first local technology innovation happened about 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. It was planned agriculture. And the interesting thing there is, I think, from the very moment that those people first planted seeds in an organized way to try and improve their food production, you could argue that our society has kind of gone on a fairly fated developmental path. What happened is that agriculture allowed a previously nomadic people to put down roots, to create villages and communities. And once you stop walking around all the time, you get a little more time to do cool stuff, like invent things, farming equipment, storage facilities. You start trading to de-risk your exposure to one particular type of crop. You get more efficient at food production and building shelter. So you increase the size of your communities. You build towns. We invent things like communication, mail services, the post, based on those trade routes that we already had. All this communication and efficiency meant that we could accelerate the pace of innovation and discovery. Industry takes root, and we build cities. These cities are specialized in their production. Some cities focus on steel, other cities focus on the trade of commodities like corn. Specialization, industrialization, commoditization. These are the traits, these are the paths upon which our society has developed for thousands of years. And I was trying to think, what's the end point? What's the pinnacle of human existence after all this investment, innovation, and thousands of years of history? The cheeseburger. I read recently that in real terms, the price per calorie of a McDonald's cheeseburger is the lowest of any other food source in history. And while delicious, and besides the fact that I think if we all started eating cheeseburgers as a human race, we'd probably die out pretty quickly. I think it's an amazing achievement and an example of how many different local economies combine to create one product. So anyway, these cities developed, but they were still village economies because place, the concept of place, determined so much of their output and even their viability. At a macro level, that's how our economy is diversified against shocks. Let me switch back to modern technology. Software and connected devices. The power that we each have in our pocket every day now is astounding. The couple of little stats that sort of really bring it home to me. In 1969, Apollo 11 went to the moon, and they had 64 kilobytes of memory on the spacecraft. The iPhone 4S has more computational power than the first space shuttle did. And in 2013, smartphone sales for the first time outpaced feature phone sales at a global level. Modern technology is the great globalizer. It turns our local economies into one big global economy. It expands and connects us. It blurs the lines between each of these village economies. If agriculture brought us together in these local economies, at its core, software works towards trying to make the concept of local meaningless. Another way to put this is that software tends towards uniformity and scale. Can you guys help me out with the clicker? Sorry about that, everyone. Yeah, that's it. Thanks. I thought I'd give a little example. So eBay is a $75 billion marketplace. We put $75 billion of merchandise volume through every year. About 20% of that is what we call cross-border trade. So when a buyer and a seller are in different countries and the item gets shipped to a different country. And there's this one seller, her name's Colleen Rast. She lives in Montana. She moved there about 10 years ago with her husband and started selling on eBay. And as global technology platforms tend to do, it helped her scale. So now she employs 4 people full-time. She has a 6,000 square foot warehouse, and she's shipped to 99 countries around the world. She actually has this huge map up in her warehouse with a pin in every country that she's shipped to. I think it's actually a beautiful example of how global technology platforms make the world a smaller place. And that's just commerce. Think of other industries. Think of Windows, iTunes, PayPal, Salesforce, Kayak, GitHub. So if software tends towards uniformity and scale, local tends towards disparate and discrete. Analog. If software is digital, ones and zeros, black and white, the real physical world is analog with all the shades of gray in between. The challenge for us as technologists in the local space is to understand those shades of gray and try and refine our software with greater and greater accuracy to approximate how people actually live, what really happens in these village economies. We try to rehumanize the software. But in some ways, we're sort of forcing software against its will. So, what should we do? What makes local local? What made that experience I had with Barry, the television installer, such a wholesome one for me? I think there's 2 things. Click. Trust and location. Trust in my story with Barry because I had a recommendation from someone I knew. Location because I actually needed him physically present there to do the work. And not just that, I needed the local knowledge. I needed him because he knew that on the street where my father-in-law lived, the big northeasterly wind that comes off the ocean brings a lot of salt. And so you have to be very careful with your electronics. You have to shelter them and house them correctly. Very local problem. These are the 2 fundamental building blocks about winning in local. And there's more to them than you think. Trust is more than a star rating, it's a relationship. Location is more than geo-coordinates. It's what makes a place unique, what makes it different from another place. What we're trying to do in this room is nail these two elements, but to do it at scale. I'm going to jump into a little bit of an example in retail now. Click. So the US retail market's $4.5 trillion market. 3/4 of those dollars are spent within about 15 miles of someone's home. And even after all these years of innovation, investment in e-commerce, still only about 10% of those dollars are actually spent online. A lot more dollars are influenced by online, but people still love to walk into a store and spend money. "10 to 15 years ago, progressive retailers had invested in e-commerce. But back then, what they'd done is they thought they'd cracked the formula, right? So that in a retail store, it was about generating a great dollars per square foot metric. And then success meant just growing your square footage, opening up more stores, more big box stores. And so what they did, they didn't want to harm that. So when they started investing in e-commerce, they did it in a very sort of off to the side kind of way. They found some hot young VP to go and start this new business, who set up new distribution centers, new databases, even entire new supply chains. Five years ago, I remember I was at Milo at the time. Some of you might know Milo. It was a startup, ended up being acquired by eBay, and our goal was to find every product on every shelf in the physical world and make it findable on the internet. And I remember there was this one large US retailer that I won't name, a fantastic company in general, and we'd been bouncing around from executive to executive inside for months. And there was excitement, but we just weren't getting anywhere. Turns out the online guys didn't even really talk to or know the traditional store sales guys, and we actually needed both. We were trying to connect those two worlds. And so what we did, we held a meeting somewhere in the middle of the country and brought them together. And it was the first time they'd ever met. They didn't even really know each other's names. And these guys are selling the same products to the same customers under the same brand, and they didn't know each other. 2 years ago, retailers were very aware, and they were worried. There was disruption coming, they could feel it, but they didn't know what to do about it. There was this prevailing metaphor, will showrooming kill local businesses? That was in the media a lot. That's been grossly exaggerated. Offline retail isn't going to disappear, but it will transform. Omnichannel won't devour offline, but it will change it. Accenture just came out with a study. 72% of Americans have showroomed. They've gone into a store, looked on their phone, and then made a purchase online. But the other interesting statistic is more than that. 78% of Americans have web roomed, where they actually use their phone in the store or at home or out and about, and then actually complete the purchase in the physical store. Smart retailers are embracing mobile and other technologies. They're seeing opportunities now and not threats. I think Bonobos is a fantastic example. I don't know how many of you know how Bonobos works. They were an online retailer, men's fashion, and their stores, the way they work is that they have an item for each of their SKUs in store in different sizes. And you can go in there and you get very personal service from a shop assistant. But then when you want to buy something, you don't actually walk out of the store with it. It counts as sort of an online purchase, and then they say, okay, it'll arrive at your house in 2 days. So they've completely turned traditional retail metrics on their head, and the density of SKU and sales per square foot can be much, much higher. So new retail combines the best of both worlds. Click. And here's just a couple of country-level examples. I want to talk a little bit about the differences, the local differences that can occur. In the UK, there's this interesting occurrence. The Royal Mail doesn't like to leave packages on people's doorsteps. I don't know really why this originated. Could be safety, it could be theft, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, if you order something online, you either have to be home or you have to find a time to go to the post office, the correct post office that has your package during opening hours to get it. So what happened was retail innovated, and there's a thing there called click and collect. We call it buy online, pick up in store here in the US. And it's now standard practice. And we actually launched a partnership with Argos last year where you can buy something on eBay and have it ready to pick up in your local Argos store, even though Argos isn't even the seller. It's not their inventory. Australia is different. Australia has a very advanced consumer, very, very high mobile penetration and very, very high willingness to spend dollars on a mobile device. But the retailers in Australia missed the first wave of e-commerce in a pretty big way. They didn't invest. But what's interesting is that sort of gives them an opportunity. They don't have the same e-commerce infrastructure to unwind that their US counterparts did. And so they've got this opportunity now, and we're starting to see it, to actually leapfrog traditional e-commerce and go straight to this pervasive connectivity style of omni-channel commerce. Let's talk about the US. That's different and much more complicated. Delivery's pretty good in the US. It's fast, it's fairly reliable. Actually, I read that Best Buy now is on average beating Amazon shipping times for the first time ever. And I think they're doing it because they're finally shipping at scale from each of their 1,400 stores around the country, which are much closer to the customer than Amazon's 80 distribution centers or whatever they have. They've also been investing in consumer-facing technologies for a long time, so that's pretty good as well. So you kind of have to look a bit further afield for innovation. And click. So I was going to talk a little bit about Kate Spade. So Kate Spade is a retailer. You guys know them. They're a brand. They came to a good friend of mine. His name's Healy. He's at eBay. And said, we want to launch a brand called Kate Spade Saturday in the US. How, give us some ideas. My friend Healy kind of works in this innovation part of this think tank at eBay. And they said, let's do something crazy. Let's turn the entire island of Manhattan into a store, into your first store. So what they did was they actually leased out 4 storefronts, and they used just the first 6 feet of those storefronts back from the street. So the store was empty. There's a construction site in the back. They made the front 6 feet look beautiful with a big display window. They put up some inventory in the window, and then what they did was they turned the entire front glass of the store into a giant touchscreen. And so it was a 24-hour store. You could go up and you could browse, you could interact, and if you wanted to complete a purchase, you do it. It would send it, and you'd do it privately and securely on your phone. And it was incredible. Most people get caught up with the bells and whistles of that experience, but in reality, it was the data and the analytics. And Laura was talking about data and extracting data from the physical world. The way that they did it was by using a Microsoft Connect. So that was in the window, and an incredible technology. So it could count how many people walked past, let's call that an impression, how many people squared up and showed some interest, call that a qualified impression. How many people walked up and engaged with the experience? A click. And how many people actually bought or abandoned their cart? And so we can call that conversion. It was about bringing web-grade analytics to the physical world. And just to sort of freak you out a little bit, that was with the old Microsoft Connect technology. It had 34 points of distinguished joint movement it could recognize, and usually only in pretty good light. The new Connect that's come out has 15,000 points that it can recognize. It works in all light conditions. And here's the freaky one. It can measure your heart rate from a distance of 30 feet by looking at the movement of the vein in your neck. Pretty cool. And it's a really good concept, and other brands are sort of jumping on this, right? They're interested in the power of data and extracting data from the physical world. All those examples I just gave, the UK, Australia, the US, they're at a country level, pretty low level of granularity. All you guys in this room think about a much harder problem at a much more refined level of granularity. You think of state and city and even neighborhood differences. Makes it much more complex. It's very difficult. And there's still so many unknowns. We don't even know what we're going to find, what problems we're going to come into. Not only that, we're trying to use this tool, software, that by its nature fights what we're trying to do in local. Uniformity, scale, not analog and differences at a neighborhood level. We're mixing these human, analog, messy physical world with the sort of beautiful, uniform, scalable power of software. But take heart, it's also not that difficult. We've been doing local for thousands of years. We have an enormous array of examples available to us as technologists to go and examine and study. And so if you're being glib, you could say that we just have a process automation problem. And just as a final thought, if you faithfully recreate the trust that already exists in our local economies, if you understand the nuances of place, of location, then you'll nail the user experience, for sure. If you can tap into software and do that in a scalable way, then the rewards are absolutely exponential. Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you, and happy to catch up afterwards.